As we just heard, the IMFC had a statement, and I think there is surrounding these meetings a lot of anxiety about the global economy. The mood is kind of downbeat. Trade tensions obviously color how all of us are seeing the world. And then there is the odd tweet to shake things up also. And I was just wondering, as someone who suffers from a high level of anxiety anyway, to start with, what can you tell us about what you've heard here in Washington, D.C., about the world, about the global economy, how your fellow ministers are thinking, how they are feeling, and how anxious I should be?
Well, this is quite a challenge, no? To bring your anxiety down just by me speaking. You know, I'm going to be very calm. No, I think that this introduction is actually a fair description of what we have been discussing for the past couple of days. There is concern around about the implications of the slowdown, a number of downside risks. I mean, Brexit being one of them, and the instability in a number of emerging markets, another one. So there is concern. Now, let me turn to something a bit maybe more positive. First is that the causes of this concern are, for a big part, man-made, which means that they can be reversed, and that is positive. So we would need political will. Yes, I was going to react to you mentioning tweets, but I will not, to be irresponsible.
Yes.
But you need political will, but if there is a will, there would be a way to reverse this situation.
Yep.
The second, maybe positive element is that there is a growing consensus on the diagnosis that the trade tensions are maybe the most important underlying factor driving this slowdown in international trade and economic growth more generally, and that there is a need to coordinate economic policies throughout the world in order to face these global challenges. So I think that, on the one hand, there is concern. On the other hand, the institutions that we have given ourselves since the Second World War provide us with a good multilateral framework on which to coordinate ourselves, provided there is the political will to do so.
So I'm, along with many people in this room, I think, a huge fan of the European project. I'm incredibly attached to people who work in that universe. There's obviously challenges and complications. When we now move across the Atlantic and focus on Spain in this global trade environment, Spain obviously is an exporting nation. How is Spain situated in this environment? How do you expect the Spanish economy to be impacted?
Spain has been showing remarkable resilience in this challenging international environment. We had a very protracted double deep recession between 2009 and 2013, from which we have come out with a much more solid, stable and robust growth pattern. Our economy is not generating the large current account deficits that it used to in past expansionary phases.
Right.
We are also, the deleveraging process of the private sector has been remarkable. Mm-hmm. The public sector is also reducing its deficits. The labor market is dynamic. Prices are subdued. So Spanish companies are still gaining competitiveness and gaining market share. So there are a number of elements which make growth in Spain robust and which explain why the economy is performing better than others in this challenging environment. But it's a very open economy, so Spain cannot isolate itself from the slowdown. And so what we see is that growth rates are more moderate than in past years. Still, our forecast for 2019 is a growth rate of 2.1%. For next year is 1.8%. The IMF is even a bit above these rates, these expectations, which are quite healthy growth levels if you compare them to the average of mature economies and European economies, more specifically.
Absolutely. You referred to the recovery from the sovereign debt crisis days of 2011, 2012. And Spain really is sort of a poster child, right, for successful recovery in many respects. And you also refer to competitiveness. And of course, there are other places in Europe that are struggling a bit more. Italy is probably the one that is most frequently mentioned. What do you think about Spain? What is it about Spain that drove the successful recovery and is continuing to drive it, right? In a difficult, challenging and global environment, you're growing and continuing to grow.
Well, we have to take into account that Spain came out of the crisis later than other countries.
Right.
So the cycle is still at an earlier stage, so there is still scope for increase of domestic demand. Consumption has been quite dynamic, not booming, but dynamic and providing an important pool. Investment has been very dynamic until now. And so that is an important factor. Then the second element is that throughout the crisis, there was a deep restructuring of the economy, in particular the financial sector. So the financial sector, the structure of the financial sector has nothing to do to what it was in 2007. There has been a significant improvement of the balance sheets. Non-performing loans continue to go down. We are below the EU average. So there have been a number of elements which make the economy much more competitive. I would mention maybe a third one, which is that the business sector, businesses have become international. Due to the fact that domestic demand was not there, it disappeared, businessmen, companies, corporates, entrepreneurs have decided to look for other markets. And they have become quite dynamic and competitive in trying to find alternatives around. I am every time we get the data, I am surprised, that they are still gaining competitiveness time after month, which shows that there is a different pattern, that the economy has become much more open, much more export-driven, with a more balanced growth, which I hope we will be able to, of course, preserve through this downturn in the global economy, and that by the time the global economy picks up and becomes dynamic again, we can even, grow faster.
It is a really impressive transformation, especially in an environment where, exporting has not been that easy for many countries, right? On the competitiveness, obviously, it's difficult to balance the standards of living of middle-class voters with the need to maintain competitiveness, right? And I think many countries are struggling with that trade-off in the context of populism, which I want to come back to. But you've obviously had a fairly sizable increase in the minimum wage. How does that fit into the competitiveness narrative? And do you think there is more adjustment that's needed?
Yes, well, as you may know, we came to the government last June due to a no-confidence vote of the previous government. And from the beginning, I had a very clear idea that our economic policy had to tackle or follow a three-pronged strategy. First, fiscal responsibility, fiscal consolidation. We still have a public deficit of 2% of GDP, which is not a disproportionate imbalance as compared to past. But nevertheless, we need to reduce it. We have inherited from the crisis a high debt to GDP ratio, which we need to bring down as fast as possible. So we need to continue on that track. Second element of the strategy is social responsibility also, social sustainability, because the other wound that still remains from the crisis is the significant increase, the large increase in inequality in Spain. During the adjustment period, wages went down, there was a high unemployment, families became much poorer. This is the middle class you're talking about.
Right.
So what we are confronted with is the emergence of a new kind of worker, which is the poor worker. Very unstable contracts, particularly the young people do not know if they're going to be able to leave their parents' house, rent a house, start their own family. And this is a very big problem.
Yeah.
So that's why our second strategy was to focus on the most vulnerable and try to improve living conditions. And then the third element is structural reforms, because one has to lift their head up, look at the challenges, the midterm challenges, and see how to set the basis for a more sustainable growth also from the environmental point of view, adjust to digitalization. So we have followed this strategy, and I am very happy you mentioned the issue of middle class and living conditions and how to protect our welfare state, because I do think that economic sustainability, financial sustainability, and social sustainability are two sides of the same coin.
Yep.
Actually, we're seeing when societies are discontent, this provokes very strong reactions that go, in my view, in a negative sense when it comes to mid to long-term sustainability.
Right. We've done lots of work at the IIF actually on labor markets, because it's so important for voting patterns around the world. And one of the things in Europe that stands out is that female labor participation has gone up, and so and that's obviously a great development. That's wonderful. Employment to population ratios have gone up as a result. But what is hidden a little bit in those statistics is the fact that ever since the global financial crisis and the sovereign debt crisis, male participation and male employment is actually still quite depressed. So coming back a little bit to the middle class issue. Let me switch to policy and fiscal policy and monetary policy. We have this big debate here in the United States on whether we have systematically missed inflation, whether monetary policy needs to change and target at times higher inflation, whether low inflation is something we need to make up for with higher inflation subsequently. That's called symmetry. And then separately, we have a big debate also on fiscal policy and whether even after lots of debt spending during the global financial crisis and now a very big tax cut in 2018, whether perhaps we need to do even more. Where do you come down on this debate on monetary policy? Is it out of tools? Is it running out of bullets? Versus fiscal policy, should the global policy community be doing more on fiscal?
We've spent a lot of time these last couple of days discussing this also. Yes. There is the whole discussion on a protracted period of low interest rates, even negative interest rates. What are the implications? What is the scope for monetary policy to continue to try to push the economy? Some days ago, somebody described it, I think, in a very good manner, no? Which is trying to push a string. So if there's nobody pulling on the other side, you don't manage for the string to be straight. And this debate is taking place also in Europe, obviously, where monetary policy has been very accommodative. Now, on the one hand, being a finance minister, I mean an economics minister, but responsible for the issuance of sovereign debt, this is wonderful news, I have to say, because we are able to fund ourselves at very good rates. We have been able, thanks to the good management of the Spanish Treasury, we have been able to have much longer maturities, reduce our average cost, save money for taxpayers, and this is very good. On the other hand, there is agreement that in the short run monetary policy needs to remain accommodative, but in the long run we have to look for a way to get out from this low interest rate environment. It cannot be that we become fatalistic in thinking low forever. I mean, we have to go back to a more normal situation in order for savings and investment to proceed as they are supposed to have the right incentives, and also the financial sector to behave in a more classical manner, if I may call it that way. So the issue is how to do that, and how to make sure that the economy continues to grow, and how to articulate monetary policy and fiscal policy. I think in general, central bankers are sending the message, well, we have done our bit, now it's for governments to take their to take the turn and use fiscal policy and structural reforms so that we can kickstart the global economy. This is what I was referring to when I was mentioning economic policy coordination. because this needs to be coordinated not only at national level but globally, which makes it twice as interesting.
Absolutely,
to call it, to say it mildly. So this is I think the right debate to have, because we need to make sure that the articulation of the different policy instruments is appropriate, and that we put structural reforms into the equation, because at the end of the day, as I was saying, you need to lift your head from the next 6 months prospect and see about where we're heading to in the mid-run.
So I have a confession that I have to make to you. I'm a German citizen, for which I want to apologize to everybody in the room. The German role in the sovereign debt crisis, I'm obviously speaking personally as a proud member of the European project, right? The Germans are kind of always associated with, you really don't want to invite that person to the party. It's because it's not going to be such a great party. There's this sort of austerity view. And of course, things in Europe are very complicated. It's all kind of linked into, do we trust each other? And, but then there's lots of institutional frameworks as well. What do you think, from your perspective, right? You're in one of the most important policy seats in Europe. What lessons can we learn from the European crisis on how European countries have interacted, the Maastricht criteria, do they make sense? The infrastructure in Europe that we've developed, the discussion that we had with Italy over the summer on, what deficit should it be? Is there fiscal space? Are there lessons that we should learn in Europe, and are there things that are missing in the European project?
Yes, well, this is an issue that we're devoting a lot of energy to, because Spain wants to play an important role in this debate. I think we should play an important role, and that's what we're doing. The first lesson that I think we need to learn from the crisis is to try to fix the roof while the sun is shining, and not to wait for the next crisis to then realize, we didn't have the right tools, which is what happened to us last time.
Right.
That is why we're pushing so much to proceed as fast as possible with an agenda which, in my view, is only common sense we need. An agenda which, by the way, is very much inspired by the federal system in the US, and which was built after the 1930s crisis. So I would rather we don't have to go through that again to then finish what we started. We have made very good progress in these 10 years, building the banking union and starting to work on a capital markets union. We have just now adopted the basic principles for something that could become the embryo of a Eurozone fiscal instrument eventually. So we have made very good progress. But I do think we need to proceed as fast as possible with the remaining elements of this architecture. And let me add one angle to it, which maybe is not so obvious to the people in this room, which is that we also need to proceed so that citizens understand what's in for them. Because the euro has been a story of success from the business point of view, from the financial sector point of view, but citizens see it, well, in some countries they still think this was a source of inflation. In other countries they think, well, this is like a club I may not want to always belong to, although support for the euro has risen recently, but more importantly, citizens. Let me give you an example. It's very difficult to get people excited about the idea that we have just agreed that the ESM is going to provide a backstop to the Single Resolution Fund. It just doesn't really get the headlines in the newspapers. Citizens don't understand what's in for me. It's difficult for them to see. So I think that we need to proceed with elements which are very visible for citizens. For example, a common deposit guarantee system. That everybody will understand what this is about. For example, a common reinsurance, unemployment reinsurance system at federal level to reinforce national fiscal stabilizers. These citizens do understand. For example, capital markets which are large and deep enough to fund the necessary investments to face climate change. We need to start giving a bit more sense to the projects, because if we just stay with those that maybe are more relevant to the financial sector, and they are, you know, all of us techies are very focused on, we may wake up one day and find that citizens are no longer behind us, you know, supporting the project. Right. So I think it's important to proceed and also to explain what we're doing from a perspective that can be understood by a normal citizen in the street.
Very last question. I know you've had many, many busy days, and we're very grateful for your time. So this is a very short, easy, almost a yes/no question. The causes of populism. It's a global phenomenon, right? We've got populism in Germany. We've got Brexit in the UK. We have it going on here in the United States. The Spanish perspective, what lessons can we draw from Spain, and what is your own view?
Yes, well, I mean, populism has also had a role to play in Spain in very different manners. Let me give you 3 reflections in the case of Spain. And some of these elements I thought we were vaccinated against, and nevertheless, you know, you cannot really isolate yourself from this kind of trends. First, during the crisis, due to the fact that so many people lost their jobs, felt left behind, nobody cared about them, there was the appearance of new political parties on the left side of the political spectrum that were saying we need to change the system, we need to, you know, abolish fiscal discipline and change the rules of the game. Now their weight is going down, but they have definitely become a reality, and they are there in the political system. Now more recently, we have then also prompted by the crisis, populism in a part of Spain was taken by those nationalistic saying we want secession from Spain, saying, hey, this is the answer to all your problems. We just need to become independent from the rest of Spain. Yeah? Right. Nationalism, we just need to get rid of the rest of the country. This is a drag on us. Right. And this was the emergence of the secessionist movement in Catalonia. And only this week we are seeing on the streets of Barcelona developments and events which are very similar to the Gilets jaunes in Paris. Yes. And in other countries before, and I'm sure also that there are violent people moving around Europe, coming from Germany, from Italy, from Greece, who say, hey, let's go, let's make a fuss there. So it's a global movement which was used in a populistic way. And thirdly, as a reaction to that, we have had extreme right-wing parties also appearing in Spain, which this is the one I thought we were vaccinated for because of the 40 years of dictatorship. Unfortunately, in the last elections, we did have a political party which was similar to Salvini in Italy, or the Alternative for Deutschland, in this kind of easy offer to the people. No, what you need to do is just reject migration, reject those that are different, and this appeared also in Spain. So I think it's a good example that in any country, even one which has a very open, plural society, as the Spanish society is, these kind of movements can actually find a basis on which to operate. And that's why I think it's so important that we policy makers or politicians, or everybody's responsibility at the end of the day, that we do think about economic stability and financial stability, but that we do think about society too. Because and all companies also have a responsibility vis-a-vis the society in which they operate, to make sure that living conditions and working conditions are good enough, that the societal tissue is as strong as possible, in order to avoid that we end up with these extremist approaches, which I personally don't support.
I can't tell you how much I've enjoyed this conversation. It's been absolutely wonderful. I know we've all really enjoyed it. You have had crazy, crazy days here in Washington. We're so grateful you took the time, and we wish you a very safe and pleasant journey back to Spain.
Many thanks to you.
Thank you very much.